Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We're meeting tonight to explore what can we hope for and expect from the Synod. We draw on the lived experience of two synods. One is a local one in the Diocesan Synod of Parramatta, and the first one of the first session of the Universal Synod in Rome is the other. Both of these were held in October 2023. Before I begin, though, I'd like to acknowledge, in the spirit of reconciliation and on behalf of all who are gathered here this evening, the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. We respect their enduring connection to land, sea and community, a connection which was never surrendered. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, wholeheartedly supporting their rights and future aspirations. And now we're invited to open our minds and hearts to the Spirit of God as we share two short opening reflections on Synod, firstly from Cardinal Garratt and secondly from Pope Francis. The purpose of the Synod, and therefore of this consultation, is not to produce documents, but to plant dreams, draw forth prophecies and visions, allow hope to flourish, inspire trust, bind up wounds, weave together relationships, awaken a dawn of hope, learn from one another, and create a bright resourcefulness that will enlighten minds, warm hearts, and give strength to our hands. And now from Pope Francis. A church with a gentle yoke, which does not impose burdens and which repeats to everyone, "Come, you who are weary and oppressed. Come, you who have lost your way or feel far away. Come, you who have closed the doors to hope. The church is here for you. Tutti, tutti, tutti. Everyone, everyone, everyone." And tonight, during our presentations, feel free to add your questions into the Q&A function, respectful, concise and to the point questions, and we'll deal with those later in our evening's webinar. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce Bishop Vincent Long Van Jong, OFM Conventual. He is a friend, a colleague and ecclesial leader well known to so many. Bishop Vincent came to Australia as a refugee, one of the approximately 800,000 boat people who fled his own country, Vietnam, after the war. He was ordained as a Franciscan priest in 1985 and was Australian leader of his order from 2005 and Assistant General in Rome from 2008 till 2011. Vincent became the first Vietnamese-born bishop to lead a diocese outside of Vietnam and the first for Australia. Appointed auxiliary bishop in Melbourne in 2011 and the Bishop of Parramatta in 2016. In 2023, Bishop Vincent led his dynamic diocesan team in initiating a synod in Parramatta concurrent with the synod in Rome. We are honoured tonight, Bishop Vincent, that you are with us to share something of your unique synodal journey with us. Bishop Vincent.
Thank you, Trish, and good evening, everyone, wherever you are, whether you're from this great southern land of Australia or even from overseas. It's a great honour for me to speak to you tonight through this webinar on the Synodal Church and what we can expect and hope for the Synod as a vehicle and a catalyst for ecclesial reform. I'll be speaking from a local diocesan perspective, while my esteemed colleague, Sandie Cornish, later on will speak from her experience at the Roman Synod or Universal Synod on Synodality. Well, they say fortune favors the brave, and I'm pleased to say that it was true of our diocesan synod here in Parramatta, which was an act of boldness. We responded to Pope Francis's challenge to be bold and to be creative in conducting the most comprehensive synodal process in the history of our young diocese. Inspired by the prophecy of Isaiah, behold, I'm doing a new thing. And here I might ask James to put up a picture of our logo that we use throughout the synodal journey. So we embarked on a year-long journey of listening, reaching out to communities not often heard, and facilitating opportunities for robust dialogue through building up of capacity at the grassroots. The mission led us far and wide, to the old and the young from all walks of life and backgrounds. All up, we heard from over 5,000 people. The process culminated in a 2.5-day assembly with nearly 300 people in attendance, including our support staff. To be honest, I was somewhat apprehensive, even anxious about the synod and how it might unfold, and in particular, how the participants might interact with one another. I was fearful that I might open a Pandora's box in terms of the divergent views about different issues that could lead to chaos and division. My fear wasn't totally unfounded, because in one particular listening session, some unregistered guests gate-crashed the event and imposed themselves on the synodal process. But the worst was still to come. During the procession from the cathedral to the Combank Stadium, which was the venue of the assembly, the participants were confronted by a group of about a dozen young men, all dressed in black and acting somewhat suspiciously. Maybe at this point, James will put up the picture of the procession, which was a beautiful image of the church in journey. There you go. That's just a small section of the group. So these young men that I talked about tried to sow mistrust and disunity by giving the participants leaflets which contained the alleged heretical practices of the bishop, my alleged heretical practices. And James, you might put on the picture of the leaflet so the people can see. Here you go. Bishop Long needs to go. And at the bottom of the leaflet, you see a picture of the bishop receiving instructions from Satan. Notwithstanding the opposition, the assembly proceeded with remarkable unity and a sense of purpose. The synod membership group was rich in diversity, reflecting the nature of the people of God in Western Sydney and the Blue Mountains. Each table was intentionally designed to include people from many walks of life, to broaden people's understanding of different perspectives. We had people from the LGBTIQ community, P-Flag, that's parents and friends of gay and lesbian children, and as well as people from the other side of the spectrum, the Latin Mass community. Together, we navigated through the 6 themes and the respective resolutions. Each session included prayer and reflection, accompanied by music, silence, and rounds of listening, free discussion, and voices from the floor. People shared honestly, openly, and vulnerably. In the sharing of suffering and hope, the unity deepened as members of the Synod began to appreciate the lived realities of their neighbours. So James, you might want to put up the photo named decree so that people could see what kind of decisions or decrees that we agreed or we decided upon. The synodal journey can be messy, uncertain, and even painful. We experienced these sentiments at our synod. I was very disappointed when the motion concerning the recognition and reconciliation with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples failed to pass. And it happened painfully on the day of the failed referendum on the voice. So it's almost like a double whammy as far as I'm concerned. But then we were able to rework the motion to the acceptance of the majority. It was the moment which reflected the honoring of a process, trust in one another, and a willingness to pray and discuss through one another's thoughts and reflections. It was honest, it was real, it was raw. As the synod concluded, the unity of the room was palpable. Through the holding of tension, walking with one another, sharing of vulnerability, forgiveness, and reconciliation was experienced, and the hope for more was realized. People were heard and hearts were transformed as the possibility of a renewed way of being church was finally experienced. And therefore, there was hope for the future. As we reflect on the experience, we can truly say that God was with us in our midst, walking with and guiding the process and the synodal dynamism lived out by the people in Western Sydney and the Blue Mountains. So a picture of all participants can be shared, please, James. There you go. You have all the participants of the synod in one photo. All things considered, the synod was a moment of grace and a celebration of hope. We were the first diocese in Australia to launch the synodal journey, and despite the challenges, as I have mentioned, we have responded boldly to the call of Pope Francis to rebuild and to revitalize the church with the synodal vision and framework. We proved that it is not only possible, but indispensable to build a culture of consensus, unity in diversity, creativity in fidelity, personal agency in communion that leads us to being a model society and an effective vehicle of the good news for the disadvantaged, the planet, and all of God's creation. The Diocesan Synod didn't happen in a vacuum. It was quite strategic and intentional. About 3 years ago, we undertook the most comprehensive, professional, and timely governance review of the diocese, or the chancellery, I should say. It provided the impetus and the launching pad for an extensive reform of how the church here in Parramatta should conduct its mission. And we are, I think, seeing the fruits of that governance reform. The diocesan curia, for instance, is no longer just the preserve of the ordained. Lay men and women provide diverse perspectives and grassroots input into our governance and decision-making process. This is replicated across the board. As a result, not only have individual agencies and councils and other diocesan bodies been strengthened internally, they have also been strengthened strategically, symbiotically, and collaboratively as parts of the whole within the diocese. The Diocesan Synod confirmed the ecclesiological paradigm, direction, and the way of being church for us moving forward. We showed that it is possible to find common ground and strategic goals despite divergent views, different positions, and even conflicting hopes. We didn't agree simply to be nice to one another or to reach the lowest common denominator. We actually decided on a series of meaningful and significant resolutions that will guide our pastoral response. I'm not critical of the synthesis report of the first session of the Synod on synodality, but I think there is a sense that our local synod has sailed a bit further out into the deep than the Roman version, at least for now. Mutual listening, learning, and discernment led us to become a community of mutual empowerment. Going forward, we are in the process of developing the diocesan pastoral plan for the future. My hope is that we will not only develop structures of governance that will drive the synodal vision of the church, but also nurture a strong culture for synodality as well. As the saying goes, culture eats strategies for breakfast. The nurturing of the culture of deep listening, consensus, mutual trust, discernment, and decision-making is a critical task. Pope Francis often warns us of putting all our eggs in one basket of structural or institutional reform at the risk of failing the ultimate test of conversion to the gospel. Synodal journey is, after all, not an event and not a program, but a journey of conversion to the movement and the directive of the Holy Spirit. As we move towards the development of the pastoral plan for the diocese and the local communities, it is my hope that we can nurture a synodal culture, strengthen existing synodal structures, and develop new forms of lay participation and partnership with the ordained that promote greater participation and more effective mission going forward. At the diocesan level, for example, I hope that the existing synodal reforms that have been implemented in the work of the governance review will be affirmed and even enhanced. These include, as I said before, lay membership and lay participation in such bodies as the Diocesan Curia, the Diocesan Personnel Board, the College of Consultors, trustees, the Diocesan Finance Committee, and more. They also include procedures that allow the interaction between the exercise of episcopal authority and community discernment, such as the review and the reappointment of pastors. There are other institutions that are truly ecclesial and expressive of the essential co-responsibility of all the people of God, such as the Diocesan Pastoral Council and the Diocesan Synod itself. These, I think, for the most part, are often at the mercy of the sitting bishop. We would like to make sure that they are permanent and dynamic vehicles of sensus fidei that are indispensable for the synodal church. At the parish level, similarly, I hope that the synodal exercise of community discernment is inherent, is part and parcel of the exercise of ordained authority. In other words, the whole people of God, through the dynamic of consensus fidelium, must be involved in every significant community discernment and decision-making. The local institutions, such as the Parish Pastoral Council, the Parish Finance Committee, the Deanery Pastoral Council, could be more effective vehicles for synodal exercise. So to conclude, our task is not yet done. It has only just begun, as the song goes. Our next challenge is to institutionalize best practice in communal discernment, decision-making, and governance, which would enhance the authority of the ordained and the rightful participation of the faithful. I think this is this can be a sensitive point, as the dispute between the Vatican and the German Synod illustrate. synodality, which is translated into governance, synodal governance, can be quite challenging. But I think it's important that we address this issue, the relationship between the authority of the ordained and the rightful participation of the faithful, even in matters of governance. But this would not be possible without the nurturing of the synodal culture through formation and training, particularly in the arts and spirituality of mutual listening and discernment. So here in Parramatta, I'd like to think that the Synod has committed us to making synodality a truly constitutive dimension of the local church, and that the seeds we have sown will bear fruit for generations to come. So thank you for your listening.
Thank you so much, Bishop Vincent. Your humility in not overstating nor understating the impact of that synod is quite monumental, I think. The kind of courage that brought you through those messy, uncertain times on the boat has not failed you tonight, and we are extraordinarily grateful. I was privileged to be at the synod, and it was truly a blueprint for the way in which we could bring a synodal way into the context of the Australian Church. Thank you very much. And now it's my great pleasure too to introduce Dr. Sandie Cornish. Sandie is a very distinguished scholar, and she's currently a senior lecturer at the Australian Catholic University, specialising in Catholic social thought, doctrine and teaching. She's a member of the Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development at the Vatican. She's been director in many situations, including the Office for Justice, Ecology and Peace of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, of Quality and Community Engagement for the Sydney College of Divinity, Province Director for Mission, the Society of the Sacred Heart, and has worked with the Good Shepherd Sisters in social policy and research. As the Social Justice Education Coordinator for the Diocese of Broken Bay, she had responsibility for the coordination of adult faith programs. She was an expert facilitator and advisor at the Synod in Rome last October and will be back in Rome. And she was also part, of course, of the Plenary Council in a similar portfolio. So, Sandie, we're really delighted you can be with us tonight and to share something of your experience and reflections on the Synod. And we know also that you're a great colleague and friend of Bishop Vincent Long. So, Sandie, we welcome you.
Thank you, Trish. It's good to be here. And Bishop Vincent is a hard act to follow. I don't even have such good pictures, but I am going to share a little PowerPoint with, oh, thank you. That's James doing that for me. Marvellous. Okay. So in my experience, the Synod on Synodality has become kind of a school of synodality. We're learning about synodality by trying to conduct the synod synodally, which is a bit of a tongue twister. So Francis is making a distinction between the synod itself. He says that the synod is on synodality, not about this or that issue. So he distinguishes between the issues that are arising through this synodal conversation and the synod itself. So quite recently, he established 10 different study groups to take up some of the issues that have arisen through this synodal process, but they won't be taken up here at the next assembly. So he's really trying very hard to keep the focus on synodality itself. Might have the next slide, please. Yes, I wanted to begin by acknowledging that I'm on Kaimi-Aigal country here, unceded Aboriginal land, which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thanks, James. If I could have the next slide. And this one, yeah. So Francis has these 4 principles that he uses, and he introduced them as Pope in Evangelii Gaudium, his apostolic exhortation on the joy of the gospel. Some scholars refer to them as Begolian because he's been using them, in fact, since the 1970s, since before he was Pope. One of them is that realities are greater than ideas. So he's much more inclined to start from lived reality than from concepts and definitions. When the Synod opened in 2021, he invited us into a process. So the Synod on Synodality is being conducted synodally, and by walking together in the process of the Synod, we're growing together in understanding of what synodality might be. We're not approaching it abstractly and conceptually, but through our experience to try to do something synodally. So everyone who was at this first assembly of the Synod at the universal level had some kind of concrete experience of trying to do things synodally. So I'm going to highlight just 4 key learnings. The first one's about open-endedness. The next one's about the challenge of being inclusive in a world church. Third point's about weaknesses and strengths of the local churches that we've learnt through this process of synodality. And finally, the importance of good process. So just a quick word about each of these things. At the international level, just as Bishop Vincent described for Parramatta, it's been a big, messy process with plans and timetables changing repeatedly. For people of some cultures and dispositions, it's felt chaotic. For others, organic and emergent processes are perfectly comfortable. During the first assembly, some members of the Methodology Commission would say to the facilitators when we asked questions, "We're building the plane while we're flying it." Well, okay. But when we were reaching the final stages of that assembly and people were then saying, "We're building the plane while we're landing it," I became very uncomfortable. If I'm in a plane and I can see the tarmac, I want to see and hear landing gear engaging. So open-endedness can be psychologically challenging, and that can be a kind of a cultural thing too. Some cultures are more accustomed to open-endedness than others. I was the chair of the secretariat that supported Archbishop Lloyd Chong in planning and running the General Assembly of the Federation of Catholic Bishops' Conferences of Oceania. And we were more than a year into that planning, including seeking grants to make it possible for that event to take place. When the Synod was announced, and at the same time, the Plenary Council was midstream here in Australia. So the big question was, how would the local churches do all the things required by the synodal process when their human and financial resources were already fully committed to other processes? So we had to think hard about that, and I was able to propose a major pivot in the process. And then the timeline for the Synod changed again, and we had to pivot again. So open-endedness can also be challenging for planning and resource allocation. But I am a big believer in the importance of incarnational processes that give things time, that await and welcome the emergent knowledge, which don't try to put the Holy Spirit on a timetable. How else are we going to read the signs of the times in the light of the gospel? So it's going to be open-ended and messy. Our choices in processes and all manner of things often unconsciously privilege some cultures and groups over others. So inclusiveness in a world church is a big challenge. The use of long, complicated documents didn't serve communities with oral cultures, nor did it serve well communities that don't speak any of the officially published languages, nor was it all that inclusive for people who didn't have high levels of literacy or people with certain kinds of disabilities. There was little time and no specifically allocated resources to translate or adapt these documents. So the process of trying to do this synodally brings these experiences to the fore. They're learnings that we can take forward. At the drafting and discernment group for the drafting of the Oceania response to the document for the continental stage, I had to argue hard for the validity and the inclusion of the verbal report from the Bishops' Conference of the Central Pacific alongside the written syntheses from the other bishops' conferences of the region. We've really got to think about how our processes might unconsciously work against certain kinds of cultures and different kinds of people. The value placed on brevity and conciseness within the form of a conversation in the spirit that was used at the first assembly was also culturally loaded. For instance, there was one lovely African bishop on one of the tables that I facilitated who afterwards told me that people in his diocese walk for half a day to get to Mass. And when they get there, they want a nice long homily. And if they don't get it, they're disappointed. So when there's a conflict in his community, people talk for as long as it takes to find the next step forward. So he struggled to make his contribution in only 4 minutes. It wasn't for lack of trying. So another kind of thing that was uncovered by the effort to make this multi-layered listening process with feedback loops for validation and to encourage greater depth was that the local churches have differing strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, in our region, in Australia, we have a very professional pastoral research office that can collate data efficiently. In Papua New Guinea and Aotearoa, New Zealand, they actually have really good synodal processes as part of their regular way of doing business. So they can make more extensive and comprehensive participatory processes quite easily and quickly. They were able to consult both broadly and deeply through their existing structures in a way that wasn't the case in every diocese in Australia. Another thing that became apparent as the process went on is that church structures at the regional level also vary in their strengths and weaknesses. And in Oceania, we have very limited infrastructure and capacity at that regional level compared to some of the other regions of the church. And this can make it harder for our voice to be heard. So disparities in organisational and financial capacity need to be better considered in the designing of international processes if we're really to hear, particularly from the smallest and the least well-resourced churches. So, for example, in Oceania, with the Synod being announced while we were already in the process of planning for the 4-yearly meeting of the bishops' conferences, there was no money to suddenly start another process for an ecclesial gathering at the regional level. There simply was not the resources, human or financial, to do that. And so the best we could do was adapt the process of the meeting that was going to take place to take up as many as possible of the tasks of the regional assemblies in other parts of the world. The Synod processes and also our plenary processes have given a lot of people their first experiences of conversation in the spirit. And meeting people and listening deeply to one another was in fact a big highlight of the assembly for most of the people there. It was the thing that was most valued actually by the people at the tables that I facilitated. Even one of the very prominent critics of Francis and of synodality, who was at one of my tables, said that he preferred the process of this synod than the previous several synods that he'd attended, because it was actually possible to speak with people and listen to people. So I thought that was a win for synodality. Now, conversation in the spirit is something very familiar to the Ignatian family, but it's only one method of communal apostolic discernment. There's been some resistance to the use of an explicitly Ignatian process when there are other spiritual traditions within the church which also have their methods of apostolic discernment in common. So that's, but the process itself really was the centerpiece of the difference between the way in which this synod was conducted compared to others, the process and the people. Okay, so moving on to my next slide, expectations and hopes. I'll touch very briefly on expectations. I think we can expect that the Synod will report frankly on areas of agreement and disagreement, and that it will point to some ways forward, leaving a degree of freedom to respond according to context. I think the synthesis report from the First Assembly gives us confidence that there won't be any papering over of disagreements, but also bringing forward what really did arise. Among the responses to whatever the Synod comes up with, I'm sure we can expect some fear of change, some resistance from some people who don't wish to relinquish power over others. We can expect, I think, a certain amount of lip service and surface level engagement that could easily evaporate with new leadership. I think we can expect too some impatience and some disappointment at the speed and extent of change. We can expect messiness and mistakes and uneven progress and contradictions. But I think we can also expect progress. And I want to stress, therefore, 3 hopes: more authentic witness, a more discerning church that reads the signs of the times in the light of the gospel and responds, not just reading the signs, but responding, and greater creativity in imagining or reimagining ministries and roles to meet today's needs. So, firstly, more authentic witness. Key areas here where I think we need more authentic witness and that the Synod will help us are in honouring the equal dignity of all members of the Church, engaging the principle of subsidiarity in the internal life of the Church, especially in co-responsibility for mission, integrating concern for justice, ecology and peace into all the structures and practices, liturgy and worship of the Church, and effective solidarity with those who are excluded, denigrated or disadvantaged. So amongst the groups, this first point about being a credible witness through our overt, recognisable respect for the equal dignity of all members of the Church is a matter of practising what we preach, and we're judged on this by the community at large. Among the groups that the key Synod documents identified as feeling denigrated, neglected, misunderstood or excluded in the Church are women, young people, LGBTQI plus people, people with disabilities, First Nations people, the poor, migrants and refugees. And the recent declaration, Dignitas Infinita, encourages us to see respect for human dignity as an urgent priority. It notes 4 different kinds of dignity, but the one that it really stresses is ontological dignity, that dignity that's inherent in every person, regardless of whatever they do or don't do. Every person, tutti, tutti, tutti. Yeah. So I think, we know what needs to happen here. Since Vatican II, we've seen greater involvement of laity in mission, but we're yet to see real co-responsibility. It's great to hear about the innovations coming through in Parramatta. Fidelity to our own principle of subsidiarity would suggest meaningful participation by the whole people of God. And the community engagement literature can help us here. So, for example, we can consider the 4 levels of engagement that the Tertiary Education Quality Standards Agency's engagement framework points to. It in turn draws on the 2 major frameworks, but that's another conversation. The 4 things it points to are, first level is informing, where we inform or educate stakeholders in one-directional communication. Then there's consultation, which involves limited 2-way communication in which stakeholders provide answers to questions, supplying information to inform decisions. That might sound a bit familiar. Then there's engagement, two-way or multi-directional communication to gain information and feedback from stakeholders throughout the process to ensure that issues are understood and considered. I think we've seen some of that in the Synod process. But what we're really looking forward to is collaboration, partnering with stakeholders or groups of stakeholders for the development of mutually agreed solutions and joint plans of action. So what might it look like if there was engagement and collaboration amongst all the people of God? I think we might see processes and institutions that involve co-responsibility for agenda setting, open-ended processes, uncovering the theological insights of the community, not just consulting the laity for their practical experience and technical knowledge, the development of structures for shared leadership and collaboration, developing existing ones, creating new ones, as Bishop Vincent has been talking about this evening. A church authentically engaged in mission would not delegate justice, ecology and peace issues to specialised units only, but rather integrate them in all areas of operations. Now here, I think, there are plenty of actions in the decrees of the Plenary Council that could help us to witness more authentically to the social dimension of mission, and the Synod encourages us to take these up and run with them. So, for example, there's Decree 1 on reconciliation. There's Decree 4 on witnessing to the equal dignity of women and men, with its interesting history. Decree 6 on formation and leadership for mission and ministry includes at Article 4 the establishment of a working group to develop a framework for formation in Catholic social teaching. And Decree 8 on integral ecology and conversion for the sake of our common home. So while the decrees are still awaiting approval, and that's necessary for them to become church law here in Australia, we don't need to wait to be instructed by laws to do things that are already within our authority and responsibility. And that's one of the key messages also of the Synod. I was very impressed that the Synod was not at all reluctant to call for changes to canon law. And there's a commission right now looking at what would be needed in canon law to enable some of the proposals to go forward. My second hope here is really about becoming a more discerning church, one that routinely reads the signs of the times in the light of the gospel and responds. I hope that we'll be committed to investing in the formation of our people in personal and communal processes of discernment, going beyond a kind of superficial application of the 3 rounds of the spiritual conversation. You know, we need to learn deeply how to be discerning people and discerning groups rather than just grabbing on one technique and applying it mechanistically. Discernment needs to be integrated into the regular planning and decision-making of all of our bodies. And this is an enormous shift in leadership and governance. Yeah. I was so pleased to hear Bishop Vincent say that this really is a cultural challenge. So discerning the signs of the times will also mean embracing a culture of encounter and dialogue, which Francis talks about all the time, one that reaches beyond the church to engage the world in its transformation. And that requires all kinds of formation as well. But I think my time is running out, so I'll move quickly to the last of my 3 hopes that I want to share. I hope that the Synod continues to encourage us to be creative in imagining what kinds of ministries and roles do we need to address the needs of the world today, to reimagine existing ministries, but also to imagine new ones, instead of being content with the idea that there are no new steps. So some of the existing roles that can be reimagined in a more synodal mode, Bishop Vincent's already talked about, and the synthesis report talks about too. For example, the idea of the proposal of evaluation, regular evaluation for bishops and priests. Perhaps we can return to the roots of the diaconate in the service of the poor and create sensible eligibility criteria for permanent diaconate. that the social services sector is so highly feminised might give us a bit of a hint as to who is actually doing the work that deacons used to do in the early church. And maybe commissioning some of those who are doing this diaconal work as deacons would be a wonderful symbolic way to help better integrate this ministry into the life of the church. We can create new ministries. There are new needs and new situations. We can create new ministries. The proposal for a more expansive ministry of the word is getting more traction at the Synod than it did at our plenary council. Today, priests are not the only ones in their communities with theological education, and it's difficult for them to speak with credibility about things in which they have no direct life experience. So co-responsibility might look like suitably qualified people with ordinary life experiences breaking open the word for lay people living normal lives in the world. This would be a new ministry. And we can imagine other ministries too. We don't have to keep trying to push our way into old forms of ministry that perhaps aren't serving the church today. So I have great hope that this synod will bear fruit in local synods and action on the ground, and also some shifts at other levels in the life of the church as well.
Thank you very much, Sandy. We've come to expect the intellectual clarity and great logic that you are obviously known for, but you've linked that with a beautiful, calm, focused way of speaking that has taken us along with you. We've walked with you on the journey, and I think that your global sense, having been engaged in so much of the Synod and other platforms around the world, has really given you an insight that will enable you to bring great, I suppose, global sensitivity into the Australian Church as we address our own local issues. And then, of course, towards the end, you're able to make such practical applications and be so stimulating for us. So thank you very much, Sandy. We really appreciate your sharing of your vast experience. And of course, we know that both you and Bishop Vincent are very engaged and busy people, so your generosity is greatly appreciated. We haven't finished yet, of course. We've got a number of really good questions coming up in the Q&A, and they're addressed to both of you equally. So if either of you feel inclined to respond, please do. There are probably some fairly predictable areas. The first one relates to women and full inclusion of women in the church. There has been a measure of disappointment expressed in the way in which the Synod documentation has perhaps not fully addressed this question as people would have hoped. Would either of you like to comment on the Synod and women's full inclusion?
Okay, yes. It was interesting to be in the aula where there were, for the first time, women who were not merely observers in their own house, that women were actually full members of the Synod, voting members. But then also amongst the facilitators and the theological experts, there were also women. And I think it did make a difference to the way in which the conversation was had. The views about women and our participation in the church covered a broad spectrum, which you would expect because women are not an homogenous group, and the cultures from which the various people who are members of the Synod came vary very widely in how women the roles of women are understood and the possibilities for women are in different places. So I think the synthesis report is an accurate reflection of the feeling of the group. Many people would have hoped for more, and there were some people who already found what's their disturbing, that they would prefer more traditional roles for women. Some people were not very happy to hear the question of diaconate for women raised, but it actually received very broad support in the aula, in fact. So there were some surprises. What was controversial, what was not controversial. There are some proposals that can be fleshed out and become meaningful. I wouldn't be too worried at this stage because the wheel is still in spin, and the things that are going to make the most difference to the everyday experiences of women in our life of faith are often at the local level. So the local synod in Parramatta may have more impact on the faith experience of women in Parramatta than whatever does or doesn't come out of the synod at the international level on this particular question.
Thanks, Sandy. Bishop Vincent, you have many prime movers in your diocese who are women. Would you like to add anything to Sandy's comments there?
Yes, well, like Sandy, I was heartened by the inclusion of women as full members of the Synod on Synodality. Now that was a unprecedented progress, if you can put it that way. They're no longer guests in their own house, using that expression of the women who were auditors at the Second Vatican Council some, decades ago. But I think it was a feminist theologian who said that until the question of the ecclesial framework with which the notion of synodality can be addressed, then the cleric centered framework that we currently inherit is like squaring the structural circle of the cleric dominated framework. But as I said, I was heartened by this unprecedented move on the part of the Pope to enable women to participate as full members of the Synod. At the local or diocesan level, we also recognize that women in the church generally have a deficit position, and so one of our resolutions on formation and the resourcing of women is precisely about addressing that inequity, and we have to enable women to have an equal start, and so that's thankfully was agreed upon by the Assembly.
Thank you. Now, it's probably not surprising to note.
I have just one more comment on that,
sorry,
if I may.
Sandy.
Sometimes I wish there was less talk about women and more conversation with women, less written in documents and more actual conversation with women. That's actually going to be more important than the documents. Having women in the room at the table, just as Bishop Vincent has been saying.
Thank you. Look, I think that's a perfect segue into the next couple of questions. You'd expect this week, with Dignitas Infinita having been promulgated, that there'll be a couple of questions around this, more than one. And people have expressed in their questions a wish for some response to the feeling that LGBTIQ plus Catholic people in particular, but more widely, particularly Catholic people, feel overlooked, perhaps not well supported in the document, with the strengths it has, allowing for that. This is how people are feeling. Wondering if either of you would be prepared. You already mentioned the document in passing, Sandy. If you would be prepared to share your own feeling about that.
Well, this is going to be cold comfort to people who feel hurt by the document. Of course, there is a very strong statement in the document about the ontological dignity of every person, regardless of gender identification. And it's good that it says so very clearly that we oppose all these kinds of laws that exist in some places that persecute people on the basis of their sexual identity. Good to hear that, when in fact some local churches have been supportive of those laws. So that was a strong statement for the dicastery to make.
Yes.
But my observation comes from my field of Catholic social teaching. In Catholic social teaching, we can see that some core ideas are understood better over time, and their meaning for particular realities is understood better over time. And eventually positions might even change. And sometimes there's kind of contradictions and confusion in the teachings in the lead up to a change. So when I hear people saying that this declaration is a slap in the face after the previous declaration that seemed much more open to people regardless of their sexuality and blessing people's loving unions, this kind of, it feels to me like we're grappling towards understanding this reality.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. I think a number of people have expressed this week, having read your commentary, there's a ray of hope in that thought that maybe the door is opening. Yeah, thank you. Bishop Vincent, did you?
Well, I understand that people have some people have difficulties with the declaration, just as some other people have difficulties in relation to the previous declaration from the same dicastery, which was called Fiducia Supplicans. As I would say that we haven't pronounced the last word on the issue yet. I think we are still a learning church in this space, and you know, that's my my understanding, and even though, with all respect to the people who drafted the document and who promulgated the document, I think they're positive points, and there are points that people find challenging, mind you, on both sides of the spectrum. Yeah, as I said, my commitment is towards a church that honors the dignity of everyone, including our non-binary brothers and sisters. And from a local perspective, I was heartened that that commitment was included in one of the resolutions that we passed.
I think that phrase, a learning church, could be a sign of hope and encouragement tonight for many of our viewers who are committed to reform and renewal in the church, and some of whom are engaged in ministry with and on behalf of the LGBTI plus community, and thank you for that. There's another question that's related to the actual attitudes of church, and it's around clericalism. How can clericalism be overcome in some of the dioceses where there is an obstacle to synodality because the clerical structures and attitudes are predominant? Any hints in how people who are living and working in those dioceses might respond and be able to have some heartened advice or words of comfort, perhaps?
I look at my own situation, my own diocese, and I am convinced that we must address the various strands of clericalism, whether it's sexism or paternalism or authoritarianism, and I think we need to really imbue the seminary and the seminarians with that servant leadership, which is central to the gospel, central to ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council, and so I think this is one of the reforms that need to take place, starting from the seminary, but also in the presbyterate. And I might add that we have a very strong cohort of deacons and their spouses, and there's a growing interaction and solidarity among the two groups, and I can only say that it is a positive development, and because I believe that the deacons and their spouses really embody aspects of Christian ministry that the celibate priest need to learn from, values such as mutuality and partnership.
Thank you. Sandy, anything for?
Yes, I guess I come to it from a different experience of life as an ordinary layperson who's lived in different parishes and different dioceses, and has experienced autocratic parish priests, and has experienced more like one of my favourite parish priests of all time when I was a teenager used to insist on referring to the parish in council instead of the parish council. He was a wonderful man. He was also the first person to take seriously my theological questions. But I've lived in very different circumstances as well. So one thing I would say is that we can make our own spaces as well, as we can be church in a variety of ways. We can be blocked very effectively by people in key positions if they choose to behave in that way. But they can't stop us from gathering to pray together and to break open the gospel. They can't really stop us from joining various kinds of movements in the church. If we're not being fed spiritually in our parish or our diocese, it's so much easier in these post-COVID days to find people with whom to explore your faith. It's possible to study at places like ACU and explore your faith in a very systematic way, or to join groups like, I happen to be a member of the Christian Life community, and our basic way of proceeding is conversation in the spirit. So it doesn't matter whether my parish priest is happy or not happy about that. We can meet and nurture each other's faith and calling. So I think sometimes we give people more power over us than they actually have.
And I guess our host organisation tonight, the Australasian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform, is an example of a very strong lay movement that creates solidarity and, excuse me, courage and study, reflection, collegiality and discernment. So that's a very heartening development, I think, that you've mentioned, Sandy, and we do see that, of course, in the approach you're taking to your own diocese. But look, linked to that, there's another question, and I think we might start this one with you, Bishop Long. How are our seminaries going to be able to provide for the young men at this stage who are studying for the sacraments of ordination? How can our seminaries provide for that more synodal way to be part of the formation?
Yeah, well, it is certainly one of my priorities to ensure that the seminary is the place where the seminarians learn and appreciate and embody the Synodal Church. You know, even the presence of women in their formation, whether through the lecturers or the professors who are involved in their academic studies or in the faculty, and the in-house training that they undertake. It's really critical that that ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council be front and center, and I think the Synodal Church flows from the ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council, that people of God approach, as opposed to a clericalist approach. You know, that whole emphasis on the specialness and the superiority of the ordained. We also send them to places like Africa, you know, the deaf community, or St. Teresa Mission in Central Australia, to be close to our Indigenous people. So these experiences are really vital to their formation too.
Marvellous to hear. And Sandy, the formation of the clergy, future clergy, was a big topic at the Synod and in the documents. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, the things that Bishop Vincent has mentioned all came up, were generally agreed, as well as the kind of specialness and superiority thing that goes on with seminaries. It's also separation, and that was taken up strongly in the synodal process in our region, particularly in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, the Pacific, CPAC region. I heard it also from bishops from Africa and South Asia, that it's really not good for these young men to be separate from the communities that they will be ministering to, that they need to learn to live in community and for community. And I'm sure that Maeve will have plenty of things to say about that. They need to see people of various kinds exercising ordinary authority, and to understand themselves to be part of a community rather than something separate and special and better.
Thank you. Now, there's a question around conversations in the spirit as a method. And I think you two would be two of the Australians most experienced from the Synod, the plenary, and the way you go about your professional lives and evangelisation. The question is, do these conversations in the Spirit help lead to conversion of heart, openness of heart, etc.? And how? And how do you find that as a method?
Well, I think it's a very useful method. It is not the only method, but as we experienced it at our synod, it's a very disciplined way of mutual listening, because you're not exposed to a situation where one voice dominates or prevails over others. So you know, that equity is built into the mechanism to enable all voices to be heard and to enable people to listen attentively and respectfully and deeply. And I think the end result proved that the process worked. That there is a genuine coming together. There's this genuine overcoming of differences, or at least the sense that that my preference might not be the only way to deciding the matter.
Thank you. Sandie?
Yeah.
Sandie?
Yes, I think it's really important that we engage in conversation in the Spirit as a spiritual practice and not just as a technology for facilitation. I think sometimes people are disappointed in their conversations in the Spirit because they've simply followed a set of instructions on a sheet of paper and they haven't prepared for the conversation and they haven't entered into it prayerfully. You know, you need to come with a disposition to be open. And if you do, and it's grounded in prayer, and one of the tasks of the facilitator is to encourage people to pray and to look for, what is the Spirit saying to me? How is God moving in me? And to speak from that, not what do I think about these issues? And to listen carefully to others and where is the Spirit moving in them? And then where is the Spirit moving in us collectively?
Yes. And ultimately it's see, judge, act under another guise, I presume. But there has been
I wouldn't necessarily say so, actually. And I should probably just, you know, declare at this point that I think that Francis is moving beyond the old Cardine formula. That his culture of encounter and dialogue is actually going, it's post-Cardine, it's going deeper.
Thank you.
It's not just I'm looking at you and making judgments, but we're encountering one another, we're listening to one another. That's inherently mutual. You can't do it without two people. Whereas, yes, I think we're being invited to go deeper,
Yeah, there's a question with a tinge of sadness around it. Peter Vardy has been touring Australia, as we probably know, recently, and he was heard to say at one of the sessions, the questioner has pointed out, that there's a certain anxiety, fear, that when Pope Francis is no longer with us, the synodal way may well be underdone, forgotten, whatever. How do you see that? Do you think it's sufficiently well bedded down now that that won't happen?
Well, I take comfort in his statement that the Synodal Church is what God desires or expects of the Church in the third millennium, and I don't see that as a passing comment or an invention of a reigning pontiff, but a significant shift and a significant development of the reception of the Second Vatican Council, and therefore I have confidence that it is not just a passing fad, idiosyncrasy of the Argentine Pope, but really the movement and the directive of the Holy Spirit, and that is being borne out in the way that the whole Church is responding to the call to be a synodal church. And so I don't think that it will end with Pope Francis stepping on a banana peel, and taken to God. But I think it will be his legacy, and it will be the next phase of the post-Vatican Church.
Thank you. Sandy, anything to add there? We have a couple more questions we'd like to cover before we hear from our responder. Yes.
Yeah, look, I think it's not all up to Francis.
Mm.
He's done a mighty job in bringing this to the attention of the whole Church and giving us an experience of it. If he'd simply made a document about it or called a conversation about it, I don't think we'd be in the same place. But that so many members of the Church have had some kind of an experience of synodality, I don't think the genie is easily put back in the bottle. I think it's really up to all of us to respond to the urgings of the Spirit. There are plenty of things that we can do to be more synodal that don't require the Pope to do anything, actually. That require us to do things.
There's a very practical question, which is probably something ACCCR needs to take on board and ask itself about too. And a couple of people have mentioned that there's no provision for people who are deaf, have audio impairment. We haven't made that provision tonight, and it's often not made in our churches and in our formation programs, etc. So I don't know whether you'd particularly like to comment on that, but I think that we would take that on board. Would that be the case, Kevin? Kevin's our convener, co-convener. I think we'll probably put this onto our agenda for future webinars. Anything either of you would like to add to that?
Well, I'd say it's right and just.
Not a lot to disagree with there. So
it just gets overlooked, though, doesn't it, when things are happening at pace and when it's complex and when there are multiple languages and multiple disabilities to think of. It's got to become, again, part of our culture, part of our way of being, to think about, are we actually doing things in a way that can include everyone? And maybe sometimes we need to slow down. Maybe we need to do less things and do them in a way that's truly inclusive. Big challenge when we're impatient for change, big challenge when we're in such cultures that value busyness and urgency.
Well, just a final question, and you really could spend half an hour each answering this, but just a quick comment, if you can possibly do it. How do we link the synodal way and synodality to our baptismal commitment as our call as priest, prophet, king, or / queen, whatever, but priest, prophet, and king. How do we link synodality with that? Can it be done? Just a sentence, if you could do it. It's a big ask.
Well, I think synodality is expressive of the baptismal and missionary discipleship of everyone, every believer. So it's inherently connected, because a synodal church is the church in which the agency and participation of the people of God are at the core. So for me, it's really a integral part of being a baptized person.
There's certainly not
the
a
whole notion
flag.
of co-responsibility and participation.
Yes.
And you know, you can't have the church the way it should be without people taking ownership of their baptismal commitment.
Thank you.
And that's why Francis really emphasises baptism so often. You know, he often asks people, do you know the day of your baptism? Do you remember it? Because this is your mandate. This is your mandate for mission. You enter into those 3 offices on the basis of your baptism. And that's why we all must participate in mission, and we have to do it together, collectively. And I would recommend highly the work of Elissa Roper on this very point.
Thank you very much. That's a very refreshing call to renew our baptismal commitment. And now I have great pleasure in calling on someone who's actually in Ireland, being part of this, Professor Maeve Heaney. He's the Associate Professor and Director of the Xavier Centre for Theological Formation at the Australian Catholic University in Brisbane. And Maeve, we're delighted that you were either up or down or whatever you are. You're very good to be with us. So thank you. What time is it over there?
Oh, it's 11 o'clock. Very civilised, mid-morning. It's all good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
That shows how au fait I am with the international time zones. Thanks, Maeve. We'd love to hear your response.
Yes. So in this brief response, I'm responding obviously as a theologian, just the from where, if you want. I'm not currently involved, although Brisbane is starting its own Archdiocesan Synod process. Theologian, and I will, in the context of this dialogue, say theologian and formator. I do work in Queensland in the seminary formation as a formator, and I use that word consciously because there has been resistance over the years to call women formators precisely, but the bishops in Australia are standing by that reality. So, and my attempt in just 4 or 5 minutes is to echo and to respond to what I've heard in a recent conversation with Natalie Beckhart, Sister Natalie, who's in the synodal process. She commented to me, and I think as a theologian I can name it, that in the dialogue, some of the least trained in synodal listening were the theologians in the room. So my attempt here is to respond to what I have heard and name what I've heard with a few thoughts. The second thing, or the thing I want to start with, is something both speakers ended with. And I'm going to name it because it's one of those things that perhaps we know is important, we name as important. We usually name it towards the end because we kind of think, can't forget this. I would beg to suggest that perhaps if we started here, and that would be a huge turnaround for the church, we might get further. So in Bishop Long's case, it was the arts. He spoke about the necessity of the arts and imagination. And in yours, Sandy, you spoke about creative expression. Andrew Fletcher in the 17th century, politician and writer, said, tell me who writes a nation's songs, and I don't care who writes her laws. So perhaps if, as a musician and a theologian, I were to sing this response, it might be more effective. But my point is that imagination and the arts are our dialogue partners. How we think about things, even different cultures, how we perform them is really important, and symbol precedes thought. So I'm just going to name that in the beginning. I have no idea how we do it, but I do think it's really important. And I have heard that in both speakers, creative imagination. So other things that I'm hearing here, diversity of voices. I think it's beautiful that we have heard, and I am in Europe at this time in Europe, there is a wave of refugees entering. The borders are not blocked. There are a wave of refugees first from the Ukraine, now from Gaza, and from so many other places. So it is refreshing that we are listening to the voice of someone who has been, and maybe that's part of your identity, Vincent Long, once a refugee, always a refugee and a woman, speaking to us about this, and noticing the fruits there. So I was interested in how you said the voices of women, for example, the voices, it changes the shape in the room when we hear different voices. It changes the process. It changes the expectations when actually we hear from different voices. So I'd just like to name that process as we are here in having these meetings is really important. How marks the what comes out of it. The next thing we've witnessed within that is we went from local synod to universal synod. And again, for me, this is theological methodology that's really important. The church is a Catholic one. It's universal and it's huge. It's a big ship. It will always move slowly. I'd like to suggest that this Catholicity will move forward in synodality and synodal identity when that's the way that we listen. When we listen more to local as a premise to our conclusions, if you want, or to our suggestions. So from local to universal is a healthy way of working. And we can't forget that even the universal church was born of a local culture, first Jewish and then Greek. There's still cultures. It's not universal, it's cultural. It simply had a widespread influence. The other thing that this implies, and that I've heard with a lot of strength, is the reality of the diversity across the spectrum. And I just want to say, I think even as I was trying to listen also to the questions, I think we need to hear that this is the space and that this is not an easy space to hold. Be it from the people who interrupted your parade, Bishop Long, right through to the pain that some of us experience in reading the recent documents. There is a spectrum, and it's even broader than that. And yet in this Catholic Church, this is our church right across the spectrum. That spectrum is a dialogical, that spectrum is also geographical, as we've noted, different forms. This is our church. So somehow we need to make peace with that, I think, which isn't a passive peace, but it is to make peace with it. And in that, I'd like to suggest two things. I think it is necessary to name the challenges and to challenge what is not Catholic in those challenges, to challenge what is not communion, to challenge what is not helpful. But I would also suggest that this is a theological journey. The issue of women is a theological journey. Even within Australia, we have different theological understandings of how women should be involved. One of the insisting questions that I was reading was about governance and women. That's a theological question because governance and authority right now is linked to priesthood, because we have not found the bridge between baptismal priesthood and ministerial presbyterate, I'd prefer to say. There's only one priest, that's Christ. So that's a theological issue. My experience in the seminary is that there is openness, that people in the room, women in the room, lay people in the room help, but that the journey is slow, very slow, because the spectrum is so wide. And it goes together with what I was hearing in Bishop Long, a systemic approach to change. It's synodal journey, it's people around the room, it's dialogue, it's different roles given to women, or women and lay people taking the roles without permission, as was also being said in the room. But it is a systemic approach. We need everything and all together. And if I could finish, and I am, this is literally just an echo, and I want to keep to time. I would like to finish on a note of hope. I hear the pain, I feel pain inside sometimes with it. But in all of this, I had the image when you said God is with us, that of Emmaus. I recently had to fight with an insurance company, if I could give an example, but it really helped me. And my friend is I have a friend who's a very, very good solicitor. And at one stage she said to me, Maeve, write your letters, write them well, and enjoy the journey, because it's going to happen. You're like they have to do this. You just need to enjoy the journey and sit back. And it really helped me. There will be pushback. There may well be a pushback once we lose our beloved current Pope. But we have to believe in the process of truth. We have to believe that truth will win. God will help us. The process will render its fruit if we are willing to walk the journey and to follow the process. That's my response.
Thank you very much, Maeve. We've had a very refreshing, energising, insightful journey this evening. A lot of new thoughts, not just the same thoughts reiterated, they're important, but we've had new thoughts as well. So it just remains now to thank everyone. We wouldn't be able to do this without Garratt Publishing. Thank you, David Hugan, and James McEwen, who's always willing to do our IT ingenious things. Kevin and Eleanor from ACCCR, who are our co-conveners, who put in huge hours making these things happen. And particularly, of course, to our wonderful speakers tonight, Bishop Vincent, Dr. Sandie Cornish, and Associate Professor Maeve Heaney. We owe you a lot, and we're going away feeling as though we've had a big shot in the arm. So thank you very much, and a particular thanks to all of those who subscribed tonight, many, many hundreds, if not thousands, I believe, of you. So good night and God bless everyone.